Hi, I'm Nick Schulz of the American Enterprise Institute. I'm the editor of American.com. I'm joined today by John Makin. John is a scholar here at AEI, and he is the author of a recent paper that has received a good deal of attention, a lot of media attention, a lot of debate, and asked John to sit down with me today and talk about that. The paper is titled "The Rising Threat of Deflation." It's a very timely topic. And before we get into what you discuss in your paper, I'm wondering if we could do a little Deflation 101 and just tell people what is deflation. I think this is a question you get sometimes because not everybody knows. So, but what is deflation?
Well, Nick, that's a telling question, because when I first started writing about this, everybody was saying, well, you have to define deflation. So first of all, it's an unfamiliar concept. We don't see it very often, but deflation is basically a wide and persistent drop in the price level. And it's a rare animal, but it's a dangerous animal. We saw it during the Great Depression in the United States, and the Japanese have been seeing it for nearly 50 years now. Create some very interesting problems. But you know, I think if you ask people about what's going to happen in the future to inflation, because that's always the way the question, so inflation is going to be around 3%. And so people's expectations about where prices are going are pretty sticky, and they tend to change abruptly if inflation keeps coming down as it's doing. So deflation is an unfamiliar place that you don't want to go. And so that's why I was bringing the topic up.
So now, what is happening that makes you think that you titled the paper "The Rising Threat of Deflation," and there are a lot of bits and pieces in that paper that you point to say, hey, look at this, and this should, these are red flags. So what are those things that are tipping you off that deflation might be a real problem?
Well, I'm looking at what the Fed and other central banks look at, which is the kind of year-over-year pace of core inflation, which is inflation extracting from food and energy prices, which tend to be noisy. So the latest data suggests that year-over-year core inflation in the U.S. is 0.9%, which is getting down there. The Fed usually likes to see around 2% underlying inflation, for the simple reason that if you're down below 1%, you can get perilously close to deflation without too much trouble. So that's in the U.S. In Europe, year-over-year core inflation is also 0.9%. And in Japan, the same number is minus 1.6% and has been there for a long time. So Japan has had a lot of deflation for a long time and a very stagnant economy.
And now, why is this something that we should be concerned about? I mean, we anticipate, or we like to look for 2-3% inflation, something like that. That's a nice comfortable range. Why would -1, -2%? I mean, explain how this plays out.
Well, a lot of people when people borrow money, they pay an interest rate. Usually if you take inflation out of the interest rate, it's around 2%. That's the real interest rate. So when people borrow money at 5%, or at a 5% rate, they're sort of assuming there'll be 3% inflation that will erode the real cost of the debt, because they'll be paying back with cheaper dollars. So if you sign a mortgage contract, for example, and it's a 5% rate, and the 3% assumption about inflation, I should say, proves to be wrong, and you actually get to 1% where we are, or lower, the real cost, the real burden of that debt goes up substantially. And to some extent you may be able to refinance, but for a lot of households, simply the burden of their debts, which are large in the U.S., is increased. The second problem is that as you get closer to deflation, it tends to be self-reinforcing. That if everybody expects instead of prices going up in the future, they're going to go down in the future, people tend to avoid purchases or delay purchases. That cuts demand, and prices have to be cut further. And so the demand for holding cash goes up, and that in itself retracts or detracts from demand growth. So if it gets away from you, and this is Chairman Bernanke is very familiar with this, wrote a lot of classic pieces about it, gave a speech about it in November of 2002 that I mentioned. If it starts to pick up its own momentum, then disinflation, which is falling inflation, turns into deflation, and it gets more intense. And it's very difficult to get that to turn around.
Now, there might be some people who would say that's kind of counterintuitive, if only because, well, prices are dropping, and that may be a signal for somebody to buy something. You go in, a car was $35,000, and now
Right.
it's $32,500. But that's not how it actually works in practice. Is that?
Well, you bring up an important and somewhat subtle point, and I think for people's intuition is typically, well, inflation's not good, so less inflation is good, and deflation must be great. Wrong. Inflation isn't good. We like to see it stable. Disinflation is okay, and it is saying, hey, things are getting cheaper, that's good. But if disinflation starts to turn into deflation, then it's a matter of expectations. If you say to yourself, well, you know, I could have, and I think we see that, certainly we see it in housing today, and we see it somewhat in automobiles. People say, well, you know, unless there's a special government incentive program, I'll wait because the price is just going to go down. And that is reinforcing the drop in the price level. And if it gets too intense, then it goes back and people start saying, well, if prices are going down, we're going to have to cut your wages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that all kind of leads you into a shrinkage phenomenon. But I do think that it's important to recognize, and the reason I was writing this piece is that it's not surprising that people's intuition about what's happening to inflation or deflation is kind of skewed. That is, inflation's bad, deflation's good. And what I'm working to say is inflation's bad, less inflation's okay, but you don't want to get too far away. And deflation is bad. And we have the Great Depression and Japan's experience to underscore that.